Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Ryan Poor. I'm a marketing manager for the Jones and Bartlett Public Safety Group. And thank you for joining us today to hear about Fire Investigator Principles and Practice 6th edition. With us and the main speaker for this presentation will be author George Codding. We also have several members of the PSG team on the panel who will help answer questions during the Q&A portion of the call. So just to give you a quick background and what you can expect today, we're going to start with George talking about some of his background. Then we're going to go through some of the guiding documents that were used to develop this edition, as well as who it's aimed for. Then George will talk a bit about the textbook itself, including what's new and reorganized in this 6th edition. Then one of our product directors, Laura Carney, will talk about the Navigate package and pricing for the 6th edition. And then we will have time for Q&A at the end. Just a couple quick notes. If you have any questions that come up during the Q&A, you can put them in the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. If we can't answer it during the webinar, we will get to your question during the Q&A at the end. Also, when we do finish the webinar today, there will be a brief survey that pops up. If you just fill that out quickly, you'll also have a chance to put in any follow-up questions in there too if we don't get to them during the live call, and someone from our team will follow up with you on that if you put any questions in that survey. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to George. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Ryan, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to people about this new book. I'm very excited about it. Very exciting to see it come out. And let me tell you, first of all, just a little bit about my background, and that's somewhat stated on the slide here. I started being a fire investigator in 1998 and have been ever since, and started with the fire department and got involved with fire investigation as a member of a district attorney's office when, as a prosecutor, somebody mentioned to me that as a volunteer firefighter, I might be interested in being involved in fire investigation. And I just fell in love with the profession. And so I've been in that profession ever since in a variety of ways. And as it's listed here, I've been on that fire department, which is in Boulder County, Colorado, also at the county team that covers the area, our county and other counties as well. Currently, I've relocated to the Four Corners area of Colorado. I remain a member of the fire department, but now I'm also a member of a private fire investigation company serving my area in Colorado, Western Colorado, and also New Mexico and Arizona. I have 27 years as a firefighter, all volunteer, including as a commander. And I've also worked as a police officer and a prosecutor. And that's what gave me, I don't want to say an advantage, but put me in an interesting spot when it came to fire investigation, because having the legal background did turn out to be very helpful, not only as a fire investigator, because eventually I was no longer the prosecutor. I went to a different job. I now work for a state prosecution office, but also just as a fire investigator, because the legal aspects of fire investigation just absolutely pervade the field and are really important to know. And so, as you might expect, I put plenty of time in as we went through and revised and rewrote this textbook to the legal sections, and I think that's helpful for everyone. Anyway, so it's very much a multidisciplinary profession, and I always enjoyed being in it, and having police officer experience, having fire experience, and then also attorney experience was very useful for me. Anyway, I've also chaired the multi-agency team and have served as the president of Colorado's Fire Investigator Organization. Also a member of the International Association of Arson Investigators, which is how I became involved in this book. I've implemented and organized training conferences. I've spoken many, many times on many different topics for this organization and otherwise, not only in the United States, but outside of the US as well. I was the co-chair of the Training and Education Committee. Then I joined the board of directors and served 9 years on the board, including as the member of the executive team, as I had been elected to that team and served as president from 2016 to 2017. A couple of things that happened during that time that I did was one of them was to revitalize the Health and Safety Committee of the IAAI. And that committee had been dormant, but a lot of information was starting to come out, and a lot of new research and frankly, new concern about fire investigator health and safety was emerging during that time. And I thought it was appropriate to reconstitute that committee and get more information and more investigation on fire investigator safety. So the other thing that I took away as a highlight of my presidency was to help form, I was involved in the formation of the Latin American chapter, which I'm a member, and also the Brazil chapter, and now a Chile chapter has formed as well. And now we have, I believe, 81 chapters. And it's now about 10,000 members worldwide. It's about 9,000 when I was president. And if you count the chapters, it's probably more like 25 or 30,000, although that number hasn't been ascertained. So finally, for my background, and that's on the next slide, and I think that I've sort of hit on this a little bit. I've done a tremendous amount of fire investigation training in a variety of places and a variety of languages, and have been an instructor for the IAAI for quite a while, and also have run the Colorado chapter fundamentals training. And a lot of that is based on and really tracks NFPA documents that we'll talk about in a few minutes, 921 and 1033. And I've also presented numerous times on the changes and the updates and the evolution of those documents. And so found myself in a good position to be able to be involved in this text. So my involvement has been several editions ago, I was asked to help review the chapters, and I did. Then I started to become involved in overseeing the review, and then ultimately helping to edit submissions. And then in this most recent edition, the 6th edition, we decided to take a slightly different approach and to have one person assigned, which is myself, to really look at every chapter and every word in this book and see what needed to be rewritten, what needed to be reorganized, and obviously to make sure that everything was up to date and well supported. And so that's how I got involved in this book, and it's been a fantastic experience. So the guiding documents that sort of, well, they very much pervade the fire investigation industry, and that's true about not only the public but the private sector as well. In other words, the fire department and police department sectors, but also the private sector, are the NFPA documents. Since I don't know who all is tuned in, I will just mention that NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, is the codes and standards organization that covers really all aspects of the fire service and publishes numerous codes that fire departments adhere to, and numerous codes that others do as well, obviously relating to fire safety. And so as a result of NFPA's presence in the community and the firefighting community, it certainly has a very strong presence in the fire investigation community as well. So NFPA has published 2 books. NFPA 921 started in 1992, and the latest edition is 2021, and that's the guide for fire and explosion investigation. Now, it is stated to be a guide, and NFPA is very clear and succinct about what books they publish are guides versus which ones are standards. In other words, contain the mandatory language. NFPA 921 is a guide. However, it is since 1992, when it was published and then revised and revised, it has become truly the rule book for fire investigation. And there's no other book that sort of dominates the field and provides not only the science, but also the methodology for fire investigation. And this textbook was originally put out as a sort of a field guide or a guide to NFPA 921. And it has evolved since then, of course. But 921 is the industry book for fire investigation. And having followed some of the court cases that discuss NFPA 921, as it's been used by fire investigators and experts in various court cases, sometimes the courts have called it an industry standard. And while that's not accurate with regard to how NFPA 921 is stated by NFPA, it is a really important factor for us to take into account, which is that the courts, even if they've slightly gotten it wrong, have recognized the dominant position of NFPA 921 and how important it is to all of the fire investigation community. Other courts have called it best practice and authoritative treatise and so forth, which is probably a better way to characterize the book, but nonetheless dominates the fire investigation industry. The other book is NFPA 1033, and that is a standard for the qualifications of fire investigators. And so that provides the GPRs, or the job performance requirements, and the knowledge areas that pertain to fire investigators in any field. Again, private versus public, applies to everyone. And that book came out as its latest edition for 2022. And so both of those books are relatively new. And so it was really an opportune time for us to revise and republish the book that we're talking about here today. I just threw in a slide about the professional qualifications that you see for fire investigators. The first two are offered by the IAAI, the International Association of Arson Investigators. The fire investigation technician is a designation for those who have been trained on the fundamentals of fire investigation and have been in the field for 18 months or more. So it's a good first step for fire investigators. And one of the things that IAAI has done consistently is to reach out to and to support those who are coming up in the field. And that is one of, well, many reasons why I've enjoyed working on this text as well, is because it does provide a really good foundation and basis for people who are coming up in the field, not only from the fire department, which is oftentimes sort of the classic or traditional way that fire investigators have been formed, but other areas and other ways as well. The field seems to have more these days in the way of students who are simply going to school for not necessarily fire investigation per se, but fire protection, engineering, and other kindred sorts of careers in which fire investigation is an important part. And so I believe in this field we're seeing more people that aren't just coming in after, for example, 20 or 25 years of fire department service. So the IAAI FIT is a great certificate for that. And then the CFI is a more advanced certification for those who have the experience, and includes having your courtroom skills tested through either a courtroom testimony class or through actual courtroom testimony. Other organizations do provide certificates as well for fire investigation, and the CFEI is Certified Fire and Explosion Investigators, offered by the National Association of Fire Investigators, and a number of states and state chapters and other entities also offer certifications. And so that's all out there, and that's discussed, of course, in this textbook as well. So the textbook originally was developed in 2003 as a manual to accompany NFPA 921, as I mentioned before. It has been revised periodically as 921 and 1033 have both evolved and both changed over time. This textbook has evolved and changed to keep up with new information, new science, when that's the case, and new methodology as it's stated in these books. So that's one of the reasons why I've always liked this manual, is because it really keeps up, republished every time a 921 came out, and so really at the forefront of the fire investigation knowledge. It had multiple contributors, and so when it was first organized, it's in the name. This textbook is in the name of IAAI and also the NFPA and also the IAFC, the International Association of Fire Chiefs. IAAI took, I think, the greatest amount of responsibility for providing the initial content, and many experts in the field who were members of our organization were able to supply information and chapters and put the book together in that fashion. And as I mentioned, it's been reviewed and updated ever since by a number of contributors and a number of reviewers. In the 6th edition, the approach changed a little bit, which is, as I mentioned, just to have one person focus in on the updates, focus in on the language, and just make sure that it's all appropriate for use as a text as opposed to casual conversation. So I rewrote as necessary, I edited as necessary, made changes, and did lots of reorganization. And I think because of that, I think the book has really come into its own. Now you'll see, as within the first couple of pages where the people who have been involved in this book are listed, there are plenty of people still involved in the book as reviewers. And so as we went through the chapters and as I rewrote or revised as appropriate, they were then sent out to the various reviewers who are also experts in the field and others to look at the changes and also look at the original writing and make sure that everything was appropriate and correct scientifically and within the field. And so it had a lot of good support and a lot of good expertise behind it, and it still does. And now my understanding is that the book is widely used as a more or less of a textbook in fire investigation programs. And so not just a 40-hour course that you might take on your fire department to start getting into fire investigation, but also into those programs put on by the community colleges and the academies and the state programs. And it's been, as I think I'll probably cover in another slide, but it's been reorganized in part to sort of approach that idea. In other words, it's not just a book that you have around that you consult as a guide to making sure that you understand what the industry needs, but it's an actual text that can be followed when you're in those programs. So the text has been, the learning objectives have been tied directly to those NFPA documents, both the standard as contained in 1033 and the guide as contained in 921. Very, very heavily done. And then recently we made sure to correlate the chapters as well to the FEMA's, the United States Fire Administration's higher education model curriculum to make sure that it follows that as well. So yeah, so we reformatted the book to align better with college course models and semester schedules, recognizing that even though it came out as a guide to the industry documents, it's really evolved and become used as a textbook and as a document for those types of purposes. So we've, as I mentioned, gone through and I've gone through and made sure that the language is appropriate for more of the academic setting, that is more appropriate to a textbook. And I feel like it's a very up-to-date and accurate book, and possibly more than competing text, simply because it was revised on a strict schedule after each new edition, particularly of NFPA 921, and also because it really follows NFPA documents very, very closely. NFPA 921 is famous for, when it first came out in 1992, it was fairly controversial, but of course it's come in and been accepted by the vast majority, if not in the entirety of the fire investigation field. But one of the first things it did was to dispel and shoot down many, many myths that the fire investigation community retained in their minds simply because of old training and not because of scientific backup. And so one of the important parts of NFPA 921 was to make sure that if something was stated, that it had scientific backup to support it. And of course, it was put together by a large committee made of members of various parts of the fire investigation community. And so because 921 did that, our text followed right along and of course upheld that standard, upheld the dispelling of those myths and so forth, and made sure that the outdated ideas were not being propagated any longer in the fire investigation industry. And the other thing I like particularly about this book is that it addresses things that a fire investigator will encounter probably in day one or day two of fire investigation, such as motor vehicles. There's a full chapter on motor vehicles. There's also wildland, marine fires chapter, and other areas are covered in this book that I think sets it apart somewhat from some of the other books. You want to have a basic knowledge of those things. Either it's to be able to do your job better, or at least to understand what sorts of things you can do and what sorts of things you can't do. And I'll discuss that in a few minutes as well, how important that is, which will lead us to some legal discussion. And that's the other thing that I like about this textbook, and that I also think that sets it apart, is a good, robust legal discussion. Now, obviously, I'm an attorney, and so I have a particular interest in making sure that that's done correctly. And I think that we do a good job, a really good job of defining the legal framework that every fire investigator is involved with. The law pervades every aspect of fire investigation, and I think that's an area that perhaps isn't covered as well in some of the other documents that are out there and some of the other training that exists. And so I really wanted to make sure to make that a good, robust coverage, and I think that it does. I think that makes a big difference in really in every day. It's okay for a fire investigator to have learned the fundamentals of fire alarms or the science of fire and all that. In fact, it's critical. But if they come out in the field and they don't know how to do their job yet, then that makes it a little bit more difficult. And I don't think that it's appropriate necessarily to assume that a fire investigator will have mentorship and training that will fill in those gaps, that, or at least that will do so readily. And so I think we have a more comprehensive book, and I think that's one of the things that sets it apart. So the reorganization essentially put the book into three sections, if you will. The first area, the first number of chapters, to cover fundamental knowledge, fire science, the phenomena, the patterns, the building systems, and yes, of course, the legal issues. And then we went to practical skills. Then we talk about how to examine fire scenes, reconstruct them, determine origin, and determine cause. And then the remainder of the book is devoted to those specialized topics, such as explosions, such as automotive fires, and so forth. So what I would do real quickly then is run through some of the chapters and just let you know, well, I actually run through all of the chapters and let you know what are some of the highlights there. So chapter 1 is the introduction to fire investigation, and that I spent particularly some time on that because I didn't feel like there were documents out there that just explain to a fire investigator, what does this field look like? What does it mean to be in the field? What are some of the challenges that you might run into? How do you become a fire investigator? And how do you keep up on that training? So we added a number of things in the chapter 1, the introduction. And in particular, something that I'm proud of is we added ethics information. Because again, since the law pervades fire investigation, of course, there are standards that apply to fire investigator, and I wanted to make sure to cover the ethics right up front. And so we did that, and of course we talked about the roles in the industry. And the JPR's NFPA 1033 had been updated, of course, as well for 2022. And so we updated the text as well to reflect those substantive changes, particularly in the knowledge areas, which were entirely reorganized in that document, but also expanded tremendously in ways that I think the fire investigators needed to know about. Fire science, of course, is written in robustly, but in a practical format so that people can read that section and not have their head spin. This is something that everybody needs to know, of course, and you just can't gloss over certain things like ignition, heat transfer. How do fires develop? How do they propagate? And how are rooms, what happens during full room involvement? And that becomes particularly important as we go through the chapters because of the latest information and knowledge that the community has about ventilation, meaning any natural or man-made openings in a room, and how does that affect the fire patterns that are seen by fire investigators. There are some infamous studies that have happened in which fire investigators were thrown off by fire patterns as a result of ventilation. When people understood a little bit more about the ventilation patterns, they were able to create situations that would throw off fire investigators. As part of that interesting time, the community really started to apply itself to ventilation patterns and what do they mean, and when are you looking at ventilation patterns in a room and versus patterns created by the fire, because patterns created by the fire obviously will lead you to the origin of the fire, whereas ventilation patterns are simply a product of where the openings are in the room. And so anyway, as an example, we've been very careful to cover the new topics, the scientific topics that are being developed and are being understood better as time goes on. So that's fire science. Building systems has been revised and also consolidated, so we tried to put everything together into one area, talking about design compartmentation of buildings, their construction types, and how do building construction types affect the development and spread of a fire. And then we have new discussion of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning in this chapter. Of course, I believe a really good chapter on fire protection and fire suppression, or section, I guess, is part of this chapter. So fire effects and patterns has also been reworked carefully to make sure that, again, that it reflects the science and reflects the knowledge. NFP 921 also did a good job this time around of strengthening fire effects, the things that happen to fire materials or to burning materials prior to looking at the patterns. In other words, what has happened to this surface? We need to understand that before we understand what shape it's in, and then from that we might be able to understand more about the fire. So the science has gotten stronger, and we've made sure to cover that as well in the fire effects and patterns. And again, and this is an ongoing theme in about everything I teach, and certainly will be here as well. As I mentioned before, ventilation has very distinct effects on fire patterns, and particularly in the post-flashover scenario. If you have a closed room or a room with a few very defined ventilation openings, then as the fire burns, oxygen can be depleted in the room, and when this happens, you have fire burning essentially where the oxygen is available. It's scientifically simple, but it's been a huge thing for the fire investigation community to come to grips with exactly what is that doing to a room that is full of patterns, full of black on black and burned material. And how do you distinguish those ventilation patterns from the patterns created by the fire? This is, in my view, one of the greatest things that we've developed and learned in the fire investigation community recently, and deserves a substantial amount of treatment. And so that becomes a theme throughout our textbook, and one of many ways in which we build in, if you will, protection for the fire investigator, ways for the fire investigator to make sure that they don't get into a situation in which they're misinterpreting something. Legal considerations is the chapter after that. Of course, that's something that's near to my heart. It's been revised, making sure that we have good, practical, detailed information, and it's very comprehensive, and I think more so than many other authorities on the legal topics. Very important theme in fire investigation, of course, is spoliation of evidence. When does that occur? What can you do in a fire scene, and what can you not do in a fire scene that will damage equipment or a product or something and prevent somebody else from being able to examine it? This is a really important theme in fire investigation, and I think we cover this really, really well. And then, as I mentioned, safety, knowledge, and information is increasing in our industry, and so we've made sure to track and cover that as well. The next chapter, electricity and fuel gas systems, again, been consolidated and revised to provide that important information, particularly on failure modes. It's easy to point to electrical appliances and electrical equipment within a fire scene, but it's much more difficult to be able to articulate and be able to determine what was the failure mode. Was there a failure mode that caused this fire within the electrical equipment? Or is the electrical equipment simply sitting in an area that was heavily burnt? And in the past, the investigation community has struggled to make that distinction. So we've made sure that we cover that very, very carefully. And then, of course, electrical and gas systems as well, again, for fire causation. And then we get to section 2, the practical skills, the examination of the fire scene. And we do go step by step through that. The examination of scene and analyzing the fire patterns and the debris, of course. And what does it mean? And again, what does it mean when one considers the nature of the room and whether or not ventilation played a role in the patterns that are being observed? Working our way through the patterns that are fire patterns and not vent patterns, looking through fire debris, and then, of course, reconstructing the scene, meaning replacing, digging out and replacing furniture and other items within a scene if it's possible and if it's appropriate, to look at the patterns that exist on those items after they've been replaced within the scene. And so we talk about that all in careful detail. Physical evidence, another theme, as I think you've seen, is the spoliation of evidence. We discuss identifying it, of course, preserving it and collecting it in detail. How do you collect the evidence, the fire debris, the things that need to be analyzed later, the liquid that might need to be analyzed by the lab? How do you do it safely and without throwing off the samples and without throwing off the lab? And how do you do it in a way that preserves that legal chain of custody? So we, meaning I, spent a lot of time focusing on this and making sure that it's all a very good primer for fire investigators to understand and to get in there and when necessary and actually collect evidence. And then again, we discuss spoliation of evidence issues because those are critical in the industry now, and you can't go to fire investigation training literally without hearing the topic and without some discussion on the topic. Data collection outside the fire scene was extensively revised, and of course, the internet gives us new surprises pretty much every day. And so what we did to make sure that this text was very much up to date on what is available out in the world on the internet and not just at the county clerk's office and things that are traditionally discussed in this chapter. And so it's been seriously updated to allow as much ingenuity as possible for the fire investigator. We do say in our county team, and it's a little bit of it's a silly quote, but I do like to say the harder you work, the luckier you get. And of course, that's not exactly accurate, but what it means is that the more information and the more data you can compile in any investigation, the more you're going to be able to make the right call at the end of the day. And so this chapter really helps the investigator to understand where to go for the data and not just look at what's in front of them. And so we spent some time making sure that this chapter was very much up to date. In the practical skills, of course, there's a documentation section discussing the various ways that fire investigators document scenes, the diagramming, the photographing, the use of the cameras, whether or not we should use our cell phones, things like that, things that the investigator may not know when they get out in the field. So this is a good coverage of ways that fire investigators can document their scenes and add, where possible, add a certain amount of professionalism to what they do, not only by doing the documentation, but doing it in a certain way, and paint the picture for a jury or a supervisor or whoever may be coming afterward. How do you do photographic techniques, for example, to make sure that you are preserving something in a way that you'll be able to go back to later and that others will be able to understand. Complex investigations is another chapter that was significantly revised. And this is another place on the list of many things that I believe sets this book apart, because we really do focus in on large scenes, massive scenes, scenes involving death and serious injury, scenes involving casualties to firefighters and public safety personnel, and just scenes involving multiple entities, for example, entities at all levels of government, or entities who represent insurance companies and product manufacturers and contractors and so forth. And those all qualify as complex scenes and complex investigations. And really, I always like to warn people, my state has more than 5 million people, but has many rural areas outside of the Front Range of Colorado. And I teach a lot to people who come from those areas as well as from the Front Range. And I always tell them, look, a massive complex fire can happen in anybody's jurisdiction. And you, even as a basic fire investigator, might find yourself standing in a scene that is absolutely overwhelming. So this is not just something that happens to the FBI investigators or ATF or someone like that. This is someone that could happen to anybody at any level of government or even in the private industry. And so what we want to do is give that basic knowledge right up front, just like we did with the automobiles and the wildfire, so that somebody knows they're not standing there trying to ask what to do. They're not sort of flat-footed and looking for ideas on how to get ahead of a major scene, but they've already thought through the organizational approach to major scenes, the steps that they might need to involve, the people they might need to call. And they've done that in advance so that when they get there, they can do a better job of investigation and make sure that it's being done appropriately and professionally. And then, of course, spoliation of evidence comes up again and is discussed again in the complex investigations chapter, because there's a possibility, of course, as I mentioned, that many interested parties or involved parties could be active in a fire investigation. And for example, with a product, if a product is considered possibly the cause of a fire, there are a number of steps that a person has to take, a fire investigator has to take to preserve the product. And you can't pull it apart, you can't test it and disassemble it and so forth. And so these things are covered, again, to make sure that the investigator has that full exposure when they go on the job. The practical skills, of course, gets to, I guess you might call it the meat of fire investigation, which is determining the origin and determining the cause of fire. But as you've seen, we're pretty far into the textbook by now. We've covered a lot of basics and a lot of tools and systems that the investigator will need to know before they make the appropriate origin determination. And so we really took our time and allowed this chapter to be farther back in the book to make sure that the investigator, if they're reading through from start to finish, that they will have had all of those basics and all of that information prior to doing this really important work. Of course, we again updated the book to address new scientific findings and new research and new information about the impact of flashover and ventilation on the patterns that we use to determine the origin of the fire. Because again, I think that's a thread and a topic that's critical in today's fire investigation. And then, as I mentioned, we get to the cause, of course, determining the cause and the tools and processes again for cause, and that's on the next slide, Ryan. Cause is, we like to know what the heat source is. A lot of fire investigators sort of run to that and then make assumptions from that. The cause chapter here, and I think the better type of fire investigation training, is to slow the process down a little bit and to focus the fire investigator on not just those heat sources, but also on the first fuel, to make sure that the heat source is competent, as we say. In other words, it's got sufficient temperature and energy and lasts for a sufficient time to ignite the fuel, but then to analyze the fuel as well and make sure that it is appropriate fuel for that particular source. And then to really think about the ignition sequence. What is it that brought the two together? If a fire investigator can do two things, they'll have better success. And one is, as I mentioned, to slow down and take a breath and think about each of these things very carefully and not just make any assumptions once you've found one or another of them, but also to make sure to consider all those possible hypotheses. The book is very heavy on using the scientific method in your fire investigation, and that, of course, is the standard that the community operates under. But it's one thing to say you follow the scientific method, and it's another thing to do so and to really give some thought as to how are we analyzing hypotheses, how are we forming these hypotheses, and how are we testing them, and particularly the ones that we like. The hypothesis that you like the most needs to undergo a tremendous amount of scrutiny, really with the goal of negating the hypothesis, of rejecting it if at all possible, and that's how scientists work. So the origin and cause chapter, as well as all of our discussion of methodology, make sure that we, and this is something that I was really wanting to do, make sure that we lay out the scientific method and the use of that and the thought process in the scientific method in a way that we can all understand, that we can all apply, whether we come from the fire department, the police department, a scientific background, or a legal background, or whatever it might be. That is a critical framework for fire investigation. So that's given plenty of discussion in the textbook. After the cause, we get into the specialized topics, and analyzing the incident is one of those, with some good high-level tools for looking at human behavior and how does it figure into fire cause, how does it figure into casualties, how does it figure into responsibility, legal responsibility that might end up being involved in your case. Using system analysis, using timelines and other methods to analyze the fire, to analyze the facts that you're getting. And that's all brought out in the analyzing the incident chapter. And then in that chapter as well, we've put the incendiary fire discussion. In other words, arson type fires, science, evidence, motivations, motives for incendiarism, and discussion about devices and things, and also about ignitable liquid canines, and that's been revised and updated quite a bit as well. Again, incendiarism is a very important part of fire investigation, but a fire needs to be approached with an open mind and without any determination in the mind as to whether something's accidental or incendiary or otherwise. And we do like to make sure to approach that. And that's sort of why we put that toward the back of the book, is to make sure that people understand that incendiarism, while it's really important, is a consideration that has to be made after the origin and cause of the fire are looked at through actual scientific analysis. In other words, somebody told you something, or there's circumstantial evidence of somebody's behavior and so forth, and that really doesn't figure into the scientific determination of what might have caused the fire, and certainly not as to where it came from. So keeping those apart, making sure that they're carefully discussed, I think helps the fire investigator, helps protect the fire investigator, and helps protect the community as well. The explosions chapter is another full discussion of something that any fire investigator could find themselves in, even on day one of the job. As I mentioned before, it's normally our job to investigate explosions as well as fires, outside of explosive and bombing type of incidents, obviously. And there are plenty of them occur on a daily basis around the country. And so I wanted the investigator to have a very good understanding of explosions and not only what is the science behind them and so forth, but also how do you approach them? How do you determine if an explosion occurred and things like that? So we made that into a nice guide for the fire investigator to be able to come out with, to be able to use as a tool, the knowledge to be able to use as a tool right away. And it has good information for advanced fire investigators as well. I should mention that as much as I like to target people coming out of school and coming out of the fire department and getting started in fire investigation, and I think this book does an excellent job of addressing those folks, this book is absolutely appropriate for people who've been in the field for a while as well. So other specialized topics, automotive, marine, and equipment, as I said, these are things that you could easily be involved in right away, with an emphasis on what can you do and what should you not do, and what should you defer for an expert. And so that includes marine fires, meaning waterborne boats and vessels, and of course, heavy equipment and recreational vehicles and other things that are commonly encountered in the world. And then the final chapter is on wildland fires, and that I was careful to. There's a National Wildland Coordinating Group has its fire investigation guide. 921, of course, is pervasive within particularly the structural investigation community. And I went through both, and I have training in both, and made sure that they were reconciled so that the latest information from both, I guess, groups of fire investigators was incorporated. So that's a run through of each of the chapters in the book. Again, I believe that this book sets itself apart in a number of ways that are particularly useful to not only the student of fire investigation, but also the practitioner. I mean, some of them are ethics. There are treatment of legal or treatment of things like cars and wildland fire and other areas that other resources just don't cover as well. Much more complete, and of course, it's got the logo and approval of the IAAI and the NFPA and the International Association of Fire Chiefs. So that's the end of what I wanted to discuss about the book.
Awesome. Thank you, George. Before we hop into Q&A, I'm going to pass it over to Laura Carney for a quick moment, who will give you a quick rundown of the purchasing options and navigate packages available with the 6th edition.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Ryan. The 6th edition of Fire Investigator is available with a robust set of instructor and student resources. The Navigate Advantage package is equipped with an ebook, assessments, analytics, PowerPoint slides, flashcards, and lesson outlines. For instructor support, we offer a test bank, lecture slides, lesson plans, lesson outlines, lesson objectives, and a FESI correlation grid.
All right, so before we hop into Q&A, just wanted to, again, thank everyone for attending today. Did want to mention 2 things before we jump into Q&A. One, we will send a follow-up email later this week, probably Thursday or Friday, which will include this PowerPoint deck we went through, a recording of the webinar, as well as some other helpful information about the 6th edition of this book. Also, when you close out the webinar, there will be a quick survey, including a chance to ask any questions. So if we have anything that you want to ask that we don't get to in the Q&A, you can also drop it in there. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. So 2 ways you can ask questions. You can either type them in the questions box if you don't want to speak up, or you should be able to unmute yourself now if you want to just speak up. And whether it's a question for George, question for Moria from our sales team, question for Laura, whoever it is, can speak up or put it in the questions box.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to thank you for adding a reference to the NWCG stuff in the wildland fire investigation. It's not even referenced in the new edition of 921. I'm just glad to see that in your update.
Absolutely. I thought it was really important to encompass that. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, again, if anyone has any questions, you should be able to unmute yourself now, or you can put it in the question box. I did just get one in the question box. is the 6th edition available for purchase? I'm assuming that's a typo. I'm supposed to say purchase now. Yes, you can get it on the website, and also you can, if you for the best pricing and more info, definitely reach out to your sales representative.
I have a question about the instructor toolkit. The ISBN that was just shown on the previous slide doesn't work on the Jones and Bartlett website, so I don't see a spot for that. Is it because it's not live yet, or should I be looking somewhere else?
It is available and it is live. I'll take a look at why the ISBN may not be working, and we can certainly get back to you.
All right, thanks.
Anyone else have anything they want to ask? All right. Well, I'll take that as a no. But again, thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, George, for the detailed walkthrough of this new edition. Thanks to the rest of our panelists for being here to help with any questions. But again, like I mentioned earlier, there is a question in the survey that'll pop up when you close this out. If you want to drop a question in there, either George or someone from our team, whoever is the most appropriate person to respond, will follow up with you. And again, we'll send an email later this week with the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint deck, and some more helpful info about the book. But thanks again, everybody, and hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.
All right, have a nice day.